There is a photograph taken in the summer of the worst drought the Blackstone Basin had seen in recorded memory. And in it, you can see three things clearly. A cracked earth that looks like the floor of an ancient sea. A line of cattle standing in a feedlot so thin their hips jut like tent poles in a windstorm. And at the far left edge of the frame, almost cut from the picture entirely, a small herd of red-coated heifers standing deep in what can only be described, improbably, as green. The man who took the photograph was a county extension agent named Darrell Pruitt, and he later said he thought the camera had malfunctioned. He thought some trick of the lens had blended two separate images together, the way a double exposure will ghost a summer meadow over a winter field. He drove back to the office and showed the photograph to his supervisor, who told him to go back and look again with his own two eyes. He did. The green was real. The herd was real. The woman who owned them was standing at the fence post with a coffee thermos and a look that said she had been waiting for someone to come and look for a long time. Her name was Cora Blaine, and she was 53 years old that summer, and she had purchased 35 culled heifers at slaughter price 18 months before, and every serious person in Garfield County had an opinion about that decision, and every one of those opinions was wrong. This is the story of how she knew what she knew, and what she did with it when the sky went dry. Cora had a phrase she used when people asked her about her thinking, a phrase she had found written in pencil in the margins of an old grazing ledger that had belonged to her grandmother's neighbor, a Basque shepherd named Ereño, who had worked this range in the 1940s and spoken English only when he had to. The phrase was this: "The grass tells the truth, and the rain only makes it louder." She used it rarely because she knew most people heard it as poetry, and she meant it as instruction. But she used it. And when she first said it to Darrell Pruitt that afternoon at the fence post, he wrote it in his field notebook without knowing why, and it stayed with him for the rest of his career. And it is engraved today on a small bronze plaque on the wall of the basin's grazing cooperative, which was founded 3 years after that photograph was taken, largely because of what Cora Blaine did and did not do in the summer of the drought. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are in the auction barn first. We are 18 months before the photograph, on a cold Thursday in March, when the pens smell of pine shavings and damp hide, and the auctioneer's voice bounces off the aluminum roof in a fast rhythm that sounds almost like music if you don't listen to the words. Cora had been attending this auction for 11 years. She knew the rhythms of the crowd, knew which buyers leaned forward when they were serious, and which ones bid with their eyes to keep the price invisible. She had a yellow legal pad, and on it she had written 2 columns of numbers, and she had done the arithmetic 4 times before she left the house that morning, and each time the numbers had come out the same. She was not a woman who arrived at a decision and then recalculated hoping for a different answer. She had arrived at the answer, and she was here to act on it. The 35 heifers came through in 3 small groups, and they were not impressive animals. They were Angus cross, most of them, with rough winter coats and the slightly sunken flank that tells a person the last pasture they left was tired and thin. The consigning rancher, a man named Boyd Casper, had culled them from his main herd because his banker had told him to reduce inventory ahead of a loan review, and because he believed, as most of the county believed that the dry winter predicted a worse summer, and he did not want to carry feed costs on animals he considered marginal. He expected slaughter weight buyers. He got them, mostly. And then he got Cora Blaine. She bought all 35 at an average of $412 a head. Boyd Casper watched the sales slip get handed to her and then walked over and stood beside her in the way of a man who is about to say something. He is dressed up as friendly concern. He was 58 years old, had run 1,200 acres for 30 years, and had a voice that carried even when he was trying to keep it low. "You know those animals are problem animals," he said. "That's why I let them go. You're paying live weight for animals that are going to eat like they're healthy." She said, "I know what they're going to eat." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, in a tone that was almost gentle, that sometimes grief makes a person make decisions that don't pencil out. He had heard about the hard years she had faced since her husband passed. He was offering this, he said, as one rancher to another. She thanked him. She loaded the heifers. She drove them 40 minutes south to her place on Camas Creek, and she put them in a pasture that Boyd Casper and every other rancher in the county thought was in the worst shape of any pasture in the basin. She had not run cattle on it in 3 years. Most people believed she couldn't afford to fix it. Most people were explaining the wrong fact. Her grandmother's name had been Nola Reyes Blaine, and she had homesteaded the Camas Creek property in 1931, which was not an auspicious time to begin anything involving land and weather in the interior West. Nola had survived the decade through a combination of qualities that her granddaughter had studied the way other people study maps. She was patient, she was precise, and she had kept every record she ever made. There were 11 composition notebooks stacked in a wooden crate in Cora's back room, and in them, Nola had written the rainfall totals for every month from 1931 to 1978, the weight gain records for every animal class she ran. The dates, the first grass showed green in each of the 6 pasture sections she had named after her children, and, in the margins, in a smaller hand, her observations about what those numbers meant when you laid them next to each other. Cora had been reading those notebooks since she was 9 years old. She had read them the way a person reads a letter written specifically to them, with the attention of someone who believes the author knew they were coming. The entry she returned to most often was dated June 1956. Nola had written, "3 dry years running will kill the shallow-rooted plants first. The forbs go, then the annual grasses, then the weedy species that everyone calls bad, but that at least keep the ground covered. What is left after 3 dry years is the deep-rooted native perennials, if you were smart enough not to graze them out in the good years. I was not always smart enough. The south section, where I kept the bulls heavy in 1953, did not come back the same. I have notes on this. The north section, which I rested because the fence was bad and I was ashamed to admit I could not fix it that year, came back faster than I have ever seen grass come back. I did not plan this wisdom. I received it by accident. I am writing it down so it does not stay an accident. Cora had not run cattle on the Camas Creek section for 3 years because she had been letting it rest. The fence was perfectly good. She had spent 4 months restringing it the spring after her husband died because she needed something to do with her hands, and she needed the section to be ready. She had let the grass come back. She had counted plant species on her knees in August and in October and in April. She had been building a pasture that could carry an animal through a dry summer that she believed, based on her grandmother's rainfall records laid against the current weather station data she pulled from the county extension website every Monday morning, was coming. This is the fact that Boyd Casper did not know, and that Darrell Pruitt did not know, and that none of the serious people who watched her buy those heifers at slaughter price and drive them to what they believed was a ruined pasture could possibly have known. The Camas Creek section had the deepest stand of native bunchgrass in the basin because it had not been touched in 3 years, because the woman who owned it had been reading a composition notebook written by a woman who had learned the lesson accidentally in 1953, and Cora Blaine did not intend to learn it by accident. She brought in a neighbor's boy named Teo Archuleta that April to help her with the rotational schedule. He was 22 years old, had grown up 4 miles down the road, had dropped out of an agricultural program at the state university after 1 semester, because he said the professors kept showing him spreadsheets, and he wanted to learn something he could put his hands on. He arrived at 7 in the morning and watched Cora walk the south paddock in rubber boots, counting paces, stopping to crouch and look at the base of grass plants with the focused attention of a person reading small print. He watched for 20 minutes before he said anything. When he spoke, he did not say what most people would have said. He did not ask what she was looking for. He asked how she knew when she had found it. She looked up at him and said, "You count the crowns." He crouched down beside her. She showed him what she was counting. She showed him the difference between a plant that was recovering and a plant that was only pretending to. She showed him, using Nola's notebook as a reference because she had brought it in a canvas bag along with her thermos, how to read the density of the root mass from the above-ground spread of the crown, and how that density was the real measure of what the soil could give an animal in a summer with less rain than usual. He read the notebook entries she showed him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This woman died before I was born, and she already knew what we're doing." Cora said, "That's why we're doing it." They worked together every morning from that April forward. Cora kept the records, measured the recovery, calculated the stocking rate with a conservatism that she acknowledged was unusual for the number of acres she had, and Teo moved the heifers through the paddock rotation with a patience and a precision that surprised her, though it would not have surprised anyone who knew him. He had the quality that the best stockmen have, which is that he watched the animals more than he directed them, and he adjusted to what they were telling him. By June, the heifers were gaining weight, not the explosive, grain-assisted gain of a feedlot animal, but the steady, quiet, confident gain of an animal that is eating grass at the right moment in its growth cycle, resting the roots before moving on, giving the plant time to recover before the next bite. Cora weighed them every 3 weeks and wrote the numbers in a new notebook, the 12th in the sequence, because she intended there to be a 12th. Meanwhile, the summer began to do what she had expected it to do. The rain that had been thin all spring stopped almost entirely in early July. The sky turned the color of old pewter and held there, day after day, with the flat heat that in the interior West does not feel like weather so much as a condition. The stock ponds in the upper basin dropped by 1/3 in 6 weeks. The creek that ran through Boyd Casper's north pasture slowed to a seep and then to a memory of itself, a damp line in the dirt. His remaining cattle stood at the fence line of their pasture and looked at the dust where the grass had been, because the grass was gone. It had been gone since mid-July. The plants that had looked adequate in April had shallow roots and no reserves, because they had been grazed on a schedule determined by convenience and habit rather than plant recovery, and when the moisture stopped, they stopped. Boyd Casper called his banker on a Tuesday, and his feed supplier on a Wednesday, and his wife on a Thursday. The feed supplier told him that alfalfa was running at $230 a ton delivered, which was $40 above the price that had already been too high. Boyd did some arithmetic on the back of an envelope. He had 480 animal units on pasture, and no grass to speak of. He called the banker back. Darrell Pruitt drove the basin roads in his county truck that July and August, and what he saw was consistent and grim. He had been in the extension service for 19 years, and he had seen dry summers, but this one had the quality of arithmetic, of a sum that had been accumulating for a long time and was only now being paid. The cattle he saw were thin and thinner. The pastures were bare or close to it. The ranchers he stopped to talk to had the expression of people who have been waiting for something to break and are now watching it break and finding that the watching is not easier than the waiting. He drove to Camas Creek on the 14th of August because he had a stack of drought resource bulletins that his office had printed, and he was delivering them to every operation in the county, which was his job, and he did it even when he thought the bulletins were of limited use. He did not expect to find what he found. He had driven past the Camas Creek property in June and seen what he thought were thin heifers in a tired pasture, and thought that Cora Blaine had made a hard year harder on herself, and he had felt sorry for her in the way that decent people feel, sorry for someone who is clearly in over her head. He pulled over. He got out. He stood at the fence and looked at the pasture for a long time, because what he was seeing did not fit the category of thing he had been seeing for 6 weeks, and his mind needed a moment to process it. The grass was not lush. He wanted to be precise about this later when he talked about it. It was not exceptional grass by a wet year standard, but it was there. It was green in the way that August grass is green, which is a darker, denser green than spring grass, a color that comes from roots that go deep enough to find moisture that the surface does not show, and the heifers standing in it were round. Not fat in an indulgent way, but properly covered, the kind of body condition that a person who knows cattle looks at and nods at, because it means the animal has been fed correctly for a long time, and not just recently. Cora was at the fence before he had finished looking. He did not know how she had seen him arrive. She had a coffee thermos and a yellow notebook. He said, "I had no idea." She said, "I know." He said, "How is this possible?" He was gesturing at the pasture with both hands, the extensionist habit of a man who spends his days explaining landscapes. He said, "The McAllister place 3 miles north has bare dirt. Boyd Casper is buying hay at a price that is going to break him by October. And you are standing here with fat heifers." She said, "Do you want to see the records?" He said yes. She showed him the 12th notebook. She showed him the stocking rate calculations, the paddock rotation schedule, the plant crown counts from April, the weight gain records. She showed him the 11 notebooks from her grandmother, and she opened to the June 1956 entry and let him read it without explaining it first, because she wanted to see if he could read it without help. He could. He read it twice. He wrote the phrase in his field notebook that would carry it forward through his career and eventually to the plaque on the cooperative wall. The grass tells the truth, and the rain only makes it louder. He looked up and said, "Your grandmother wrote this in 1956. Cora said, "She learned it in 1953, and it took her 3 years to trust it enough to write it down." He stood there in the August light, and she poured him coffee from the thermos, and Teo came down the fence line with a clipboard. And they stood there, the 3 of them, while the thin cattle on 3 miles of county road ate $30 a ton hay, and the red heifers behind them moved through the paddock rotation with the unhurried confidence of animals that have never had reason to be afraid. The crisis finished what it had started. The Extension Office calculated later that across the Blackstone Basin, 41% of cattle operations sold down their herds in August and September of that year. Some of them at prices that did not cover their debt, some of them selling animals they had built bloodlines over 20 years to produce. Boyd Casper sold 200 head in late August at a price that he described to Darrell Pruitt, in a tone stripped of everything but fact, as the worst sale he had made in 30 years of ranching. He retained his core herd. He did not lose the ranch. He counted these as victories, and they were. He came to see Cora on a Wednesday in early September. She was in the south paddock with Teo, counting crowns again, because the rotation had run long on one section, and she wanted to know the recovery rate before she made the next move. She saw Boyd's truck at the gate, and she came to it and stood on her side of the fence with her notebook under her arm, and she waited. He was not a man who found apology easy, and he did not find it easy now. He looked at the pasture. He looked at the heifers, which had continued to gain, and which Cora had estimated, based on the weight records, would average out to a return of more than 3 times what she had paid for them if she sold in October. He looked at his hat brim for a moment and then looked at her. He said, "I told you those animals were problem animals." She said, "They were. They're not now." He said, "I told you the pasture was in bad shape." She said, "It was. It's not now." He was quiet. He had the look of a man paying a debt he has owed for a long time, and finding that paying it does not actually make it lighter. He said, "I don't know how you knew. I have run cattle on this basin for 30 years, and I did not know this was possible." She said, "My grandmother knew it. She just didn't have anybody to tell." He nodded once and looked away and then back. He said, "I've got 40 cows I'm going to have to sell if I can't find grass." His voice had changed register. This was not the voice that had spoken to her in the auction barn. This was the voice of a man explaining a wound. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I've got 120 acres of the east section that I rested this year and didn't use. The fence is good. The water is running from the spring. I'll let you graze it at hay equivalent cost, same as if you'd bought the feed." He said that was more than fair. She said, "I know it is. I'm not offering it because it's fair. I'm offering it because the grass is there and your cows need it." He brought 40 cows to the east section the following Monday. They stayed for 9 weeks and came off in better condition than they had gone on. Cora charged him the going hay rate per animal unit per day, calculated on a table she and Teo had worked out the previous weekend, and she kept the records in the 12th notebook alongside the heifer weight gains and the crown counts and the paddock rotation schedules. 3 other ranchers came to her before October. She helped 2 of them the same way she helped Boyd Casper, on the same terms, calculated the same way. The third, she turned away, not out of meanness, but because the east section had reached its capacity, and she would not overgraze a pasture that had taken 3 years to build, not for any price, not for any amount of neighborly pressure. She offered instead to walk the man's own pastures with him and show him what she was looking for, what Nola had written in 1956, what the plant crowns could tell him about what his soil still had to offer. He agreed, skeptically. She spent 4 hours on his property on a Saturday in late September. She showed him 2 paddocks he had written off as depleted that she calculated could carry a light stocking rate for another 6 weeks. He used them. They held. He told Darrell Pruitt about it in November, and Darrell wrote an article for the Basin's ranching newsletter, 4 paragraphs that described what he had seen at Camas Creek and what Cora had explained to him about the notebooks and the plant recovery methodology and the rotational grazing records. He quoted the phrase. He credited Nola Reyes Blaine by name. The article prompted 7 calls to the extension office in the first week, which was more calls than any article in the newsletter's history had generated. Darrell called Cora and told her this, and she said she was not surprised and asked what the callers wanted to know. He said they wanted to know if they could come and look. She said she would need to think about that. She thought about it for a week. She talked to Teo about it while they moved the heifers in late October, the last rotation before the animals came off pasture for the season. The heifers had averaged a weight gain that put the return, when Cora sold them in the first week of November, at a little over $4,100 per head above purchase price, a total return across 35 animals that she calculated on a clean page at the back of the 12th notebook, and which she did not share with anyone, because it was not the point. She sold the heifers. She deposited the revenue. She fixed the south section fence that she had been deferring for 2 seasons. And then she called Darrell Pruitt back and told him she would hold a field day at Camas Creek in the following April, open to anyone in the basin who wanted to come, free of charge, on the condition that they came prepared to work rather than watch. She said she would demonstrate the crown counting method, the paddock design, the rotation calculation, and the record-keeping system. She said she would make copies of the relevant pages from Nola's notebooks available to anyone who asked, because the knowledge in them belonged to the land and not to her. Darrell asked if she wanted him to organize it through the extension office. She said that would be fine, but that she would run the field day herself. He said, of course. 41 people came to Camas Creek on the 3rd Saturday of April, which was the most people who had stood on that property since Nola's funeral in 1979. They stood in the south paddock, and Cora walked them through the methodology with the straightforward precision of a person who has explained a useful thing many times in her head and is finally getting to explain it out loud. Teo worked alongside her, demonstrating the crown count on his knees in the new spring grass, showing people where to look and what they were looking for. Cora held Nola's notebook and read from it when the reading made a point better than her own words could. Boyd Casper stood at the back of the group in the first session and did not say much. When it was over and people were milling and asking questions, he worked his way to the front and stood next to Cora and looked at the page she was holding open. He read it. He read it again in the way she had once described Nola reading her own notes. Slowly, and then again, as if making sure the words had not changed since the first reading. He said, "She wrote this in 1956. Cora said, "She did." He said, "And nobody knew." Cora said, "She wrote it in a notebook. She didn't have anyone to tell." He nodded. He looked at the pasture. The new grass was coming in across the south section in the steady, dense, unhurried way of plants that have roots deep enough not to panic. The red heifers were gone, sold, and dispersed across 3 other operations in the basin. But there was a new group in the north paddock now, a smaller group that Cora had purchased in March, again at a price below what anyone else would have bid, from a consignment that nobody wanted. She was doing it again. Boyd Casper saw that and understood it completely, and the understanding had the quality of a door opening onto a room that had always been there, and that he had simply never had reason to enter. He said, "I'd like to bring my son next time, if there is a next time." She said there would be. The field day at Camas Creek became an annual event. In its first 5 years, it drew ranchers from 4 counties. In the 3rd year, Teo Archuleta presented his own segment on the paddock design methodology, which he had by then refined and adapted and recorded in a notebook of his own, the first of what would eventually be 6. In the 4th year, a graduate student from the land-grant university attended and subsequently wrote a thesis on historical range management records in the Intermountain West, using Nola's 11 notebooks as a primary source. The thesis was cited twice in peer-reviewed journals and once in a federal grazing policy comment period. The grazing cooperative that Darrell Pruitt helped to organize in the basin 2 years after the drought has, at the time of this telling, 63 member operations. Its founding document contains one paragraph that is not procedural or legal in nature. It was written by Cora Blaine at Darrell's request, and it reads in its entirety as follows. This cooperative exists because one woman wrote down what she learned and another woman read it, and because the knowledge of how a piece of land wants to be used is not the property of any one person, but of everyone who will depend on it. We are not the first to learn this. We will not be the last. Keep the records. Cora Blaine is 61 years old at the time of this telling. She still runs cattle on Camas Creek. She still weighs the heifers every 3 weeks and writes the numbers in the current notebook, which is the 17th in the sequence if you count from Nola's first, and the 6th if you count from Cora's first. She still counts the crowns in April on her knees in rubber boots, and Teo still works alongside her. And there is now a young woman named Paloma who has been working with them for 2 seasons and who asks questions with the particular quality of attention that Cora recognizes, because it is the same quality she brought to reading 11 composition notebooks as a child. The attention of someone who believes the information was written specifically for them. She showed Paloma the 1956 entry on a morning in early May, and she let her read it without explaining it first, and she watched to see if the young woman could read it without help. She could. Paloma looked up and said, "She already knew what we're doing." Cora said, "That's why we're doing it." In the south pasture at Camas Creek, on a post at the corner of the section that Nola called the North Section and Cora has always called the same, there is a metal plate that Cora bolted to the wood 2 winters ago. It is not decorative. It is the kind of plate used for equipment tagging, the kind that is meant to last. It has one line on it, in stamped letters, and the line is this: "The grass tells the truth, and the rain only makes it louder." That is all it says. It is enough.